Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to the IFPDA Fair, especially on this beautiful Saturday. It is my pleasure to introduce today's talk. My name is Dakota Sika. I am a partner at the Leslie Feely Gallery and a current board member of the IFPDA. Today we have Printing Contemporary, a conversation with the next generation of artists, making print an essential part of their practice. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Elleree Erdos, who is a director of prints and editions at the David Zwirner Gallery. She's in charge of publishing as well as print-focused exhibitions and special projects. Last year, she curated the inaugural exhibition at Print Center, their new space on 24th Street, Visual Record, the materiality of sound in print. I'm going to pass it on to Elleree now to introduce the panelists. Thank you and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dakota. Thank you all for spending your afternoon here at the Print Fair. I'm really excited to introduce three contemporary artists who've been working in print in really exciting, new, unexpected new ways, and just to talk to them today about how print factors into their broader practices. And I hope we can kind of come away from this conversation with a better understanding of how some contemporary artists are thinking about print not only from a technical point of view, but really how the ideas and concepts of print are finding their way into their broader practices. So I'll introduce them each briefly, and then we'll chat for 40 or 45 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to start by introducing Jameson. Jameson's just tell you a little bit about his paintings. And I think the images are also going to be on a loop showing both paintings and prints so everyone can sort of get a sense of these artists' practices. Jameson Green's paintings are rendered in a visual language steeped in art history, placing references such as Picasso, Goya, and Guston alongside popular sources such as early 20th century cartoons. His narrative scenes are critical, often confrontational, and unapologetically direct as they tackle issues of social and political injustice, racial division, and corruption with undertones of both fear and hope. Jameson's been making prints at both Jungle Press and Two Palms, where he's been working on a new series of monotypes. In the middle here, we have Josephine Halvorson, whose work foregrounds firsthand experience and observation. She works primarily in painting, but also in sculpture and printmaking, and her work is deeply rooted in an interest in time, as well as the relationship of the painted surface to truth, illusion, and reality. Josephine's made prints at Flying Horse Editions and Wingate Studios, and also has been inspired to incorporate some concepts of printmaking into her paintings. And right to my left is Chase Hall. Chase Hall's practice responds to generational celebrations and traumas encoded throughout American history. Responding to a variety of social and visual systems, Hall generates images whose materiality is as crucial to their compositional makeup as their approach to representation. The central body of Chase's paintings are made from brewed coffee mixed with acrylic pigments on cotton support. And a recent group of works he's been working on at Pace Prints uses coffee grounds roasted to different levels to achieve varying shades of blackness, brownness, and subtle surface texture. I want to begin just kind of by hearing about each of your experiences with printmaking thus far. So I'd love it if you could sort of each share your first exposure to prints and printmaking. Maybe we can start with you, Chase.
Yeah, I was introduced to printmaking through an older artist who was a mentor to me, and we were looking at some of my drawings and paintings. And he was like, "Have you ever made prints? I think your line would translate well in the printmaking world, and you can learn so much from how it can kind of influence your line and your mark that you're making in your paintings." So that was the beginning of 2021, and I started working with Justin Israels at Pace Prints, and over the last 3 years, We've developed ways to refine coffee grounds into different inks, as well as a technique that he's also developing in his own way called the jigsaw relief. So it opened up a lot of opportunity to learn about composition and image construction and the difference between this kind of individual journey of making a painting versus kind of working with an orchestra, if you will, when you think about printmaking. So delegating and working with someone else for the first time and understanding what's working about an image versus just making an image. So it has been the most kind of bountiful source of artistic education that I've had in the last few years, and it's translated in so many ways of how I look at the world and look at images and also construct and deconstruct images as well.
Thank you. Josephine?
I can't remember when I first saw my first print, but I do remember seeing a Daumier print, and that really struck me as something that had the trace of his hand without it being a painting. And I, as a teenager, was interested in reproductions of art. That was really how I was able to see art for the first time. So printmaking for me has always been a way into the thinking of an artist and being able to really live with it in a way that paintings felt maybe more, in kind of more elite spaces like institutions and museums, and didn't quite have access to it. So I think it was really a way into painting. Although the first time I learned printmaking was from Valerie Hammond, who I ran into right when I arrived at the print fair, and I think she has work at Plant House Gallery here. So that really opened up the possibilities for me.
Thank you. Jameson?
Yeah, for myself, my first experience with prints was when I first got into high school. I started going to the Yale Art Gallery, and I noticed a few. At the time, I didn't have the knowledge of it, so it's like I saw different images that I didn't know what an etching was, or what a lithograph was. So I just tried to mimic it the best I could with the materials that I can get my hands on. And then I was blessed enough to actually get involved with Educational Center of the Arts in high school, and I started working on wood blocks and linoleum. And then after that, it was a very long time before I got back into printmaking. But I kept that same interest and really obsession with line, because that was the basis of how I understood painting. So it wasn't up until recently I got back into printmaking, which was more like this year. So
And
yeah.
can I ask what sparked that? Getting back into it just
I always
just
wanted
recently?
to. I just
Okay.
didn't really have the opportunities to really get into it and dive into it. So it was, as soon as I was able to work with Jungle Press and Two Palms, it was very, very much like, okay, let's do this. So I always wanted to.
Fantastic. And Chase, you came at printmaking directly from the experimental angle, as opposed to going through and learning all the techniques in a more traditional way. And so I'm curious to hear kind of how that approach has impacted your overall practice, and then also just the way you think about prints.
Yeah, I think this kind of experimental kind of curiosity that I was kind of toying with by myself started to just ask and prompt me to kind of recognize what the material and the chemistry was doing and how could I take it further. So I think through the experimental phase of just making a mess with coffee and trying to mull it together and heating things up and mixing it with linseed oil and crock pots and under roasting, and just was out in the world really gathering all of the coffee beans I could find. And then Justin and I worked tirelessly, just how are we going to get this to work? And I would kind of just be I don't know, but I think we can get the grounds to act like the paintings or vice versa. And we just kind of kept going at it. And I think the metaphor that makes the most sense for me is I was a derby box racer making a go-kart in my home garage. And then with Paste Prints, it's Justin's over there with the car's on stilts, we're changing the wheels, we're putting in a new engine, and all of a sudden, the vehicle is going a lot faster. I get to drive at a speed that's more exciting to me, and I get to take what I actually recognize as parts I'm better at, and delegate and believe in someone that knows a lot more about things than me as well. So it's a great collaborative effort. And I think the excitement of experimenting and not knowing what was coming from it just drove us kind of constantly to be texting late at night or on the days off, getting together and just really making a commitment. And I think through that friendship, it was the first time in my artistic practice that I've ever had of someone working with me. I work out of my house. I don't have assistants. So working with the print shop, Sarah, Fiona, Mackenzie, Justin, like they were all dedicated, and every single bizarre question I had or commitment to the material that I wanted to explore, they were like, let's go in head first. And that allowed me to realize that ideating is just as important as the technical, and you never can let one outbalance the other, because then there's this kind of discrepancy in the outcome. And I found we were a great balance through experimentation and the history of printmaking, and making sure he taught me as much as he could through those questions as well.
I think that's a great point too, that for so many artists, collaborative printmaking is really the first opportunity to be working collaboratively outside their studio, especially for painters who are, it's kind of a much more of a solo practice. And I'm curious to hear, Jameson, too, about your experience at Two Palms. What you look to David Lasry, who I think is here, to sort of as guidance, and how that your experience, similarly experimental and monotypes and new techniques, has been for you, and sort of what you've learned from that.
Yeah, it's been a really exciting process. It's different than being in the studio, especially for myself. I'm really isolated in the studio, and it's really only myself that has to pretty much solve any problem I come across. So it's interesting to be able to be in a space where there's a bunch of people who I can pick their brain, I can ask questions, and often they will have the answer to the problem. And I think it's an advantage compared to being like in the studio, where I would have to go and very much find the answer find a solution to the problem through research, from looking at other painters, which is very much part of the process. It speeds things up. So, and then being able to engage with so many new materials, I mean, it's very much like, in my case, it's like it's like walking into a toy store when you're a kid. You got all these options, and you don't really know what to do first. And I'm still trying to figure that out. Yeah.
That's great. I wanted to shift a little to talk about sort of some of the concepts that you're working with. And Josephine, your work is really interested in time and the ways that time's passing is marked or lived. And I'm curious how this process, or this is present in your printmaking practice and process, and sort of how printmaking affects your work's relationship to time.
Yeah, I can speak about this through a very specific print that I made with Wingate Studio, which is here at the fair. And it was a 5-plate etching that we made of a fire and a flame. Yes, I think there's some pictures here. And that's the referent, the stove. And it was interesting because my work is, I don't think in terms of images, but rather how to translate experience into, materially, and have a record of it. And printmaking has been challenging for me in understanding how an image kind of arrives. And but I knew that I wanted to work with this fire image because I could then. It was something very fast and changing, which I'm drawn to, is subjects that are, transforming, before my eyes, just like time itself, I guess. So the fire was burning, and there was this flame, and the more I worked on it, the kind of more it occurred to me that it was the slowest way that I've ever made an image of the fastest thing, the most unfixed thing, like light. And I think we spent the better part of a winter. I mean, it was definitely still winter because we were heated by the stove the whole time. And this is in New Hampshire, where Wingate Studio is. And really kind of how to capture a sense of something changing in time while looking at it, but also making it and planning, which, so much of printmaking is planning, but also chance. And so I'm really interested in all of these kinds of contradictions and challenges within the medium, which is so completely different from painting, which has a more, for me, a kind of recording sensibility. I make a mark and it's there. Something that was in the present becomes past and is evidenced. But printmaking has a way of almost suspending time, you really have to focus on that in a way that I think has just taught me so much. Yeah.
You've also said to me, I think that you mentioned something about sort of the facticity of print, and that was sort of specifically through your project with Flying Horse at one point, that you were sort of inspired to use that and that concept in some ways by carrying screen print into your paintings. Can you talk a little about that?
Yes, and there were some images here. I'm sorry that there aren't captions for you, but it's hard to see on a screen anyway. But I did work with this motif of the ruler, or a kind of unit of measurement. And with Flying Horse, we did a screen print of this tape measure.
Here we go.
Yes, and then kind of on the page, I would make a painting. So they were all kind of calibrated through this tape measure, and then that kind of carried over into my paintings, where these units of calibration were ways of understanding reality, of looking at something and bearing witness to it, and in this kind of post-fact, post-truth time that we're in, there's something about printmaking that has a way of really kind of stamping a certain kind of reality or fact that happened, when it goes through the press and something is kind of translated, in this way that does feel quite factual. There's a remove of like the artist's hand a bit, so the subjectivity is kind of kept in check a little bit. There's consensus and the collaborative kind of nature of printmaking, and there's a way that it does end up having, of course, its relationship to print media, newspapers, and actually these were all the size of a broadsheet, the size of the New York Times unfolded. So I was thinking, and I've worked in this size for a while as well, thinking about kind of all the news that's fit to print and what can be, how can you, if it's ever possible, to evidence your own witnessing of something.
I think it's really interesting to think about these concepts that are more broadly applicable, through print, and how they show up in other places, and really, or once you've made the print and had that experience, that's kind of just becomes a way of thinking that you can apply and carry. And I'm curious, Chase or Jameson, if there are concepts or ideas that you've learned through the printmaking process that you've carried into your painting practice. Either one of you.
Yeah, I think for me, what I really understood was when you make a painting, it's this kind of individual adventure of working through an image. And I think with printmaking, there's 1 to 4 people around you, and you're looking at 8 proofs, and they're looking at you like, "So, buddy, what do you think?" You're like, "Oh, wow, this is very different than just like finishing a painting by myself in my house." So now all of a sudden the darks, the lights, the midtones, the vignetting, the eye line, the posture, when you start to understand what's working and what's not working, you're really delineating your idea and you're really constructing an image, and then you're understanding this kind of blueprint and infrastructure, and kind of like meat and potatoes of what makes a composition exciting to you. So I think recognizing it's not just like go through the painting, it's like, what about this print or this image or this subject or what I'm putting down here is actually effective, and how can I bring that through into a painting? So mapping out color as well as line, delineating negative space, and then thinking about how a print is something that you're going to spend time with and just ruminate on and meditate on and return back to. It's not just like an idea that you cover up or you make a mark around. So it's this kind of like sturdy principle or kind of governance of the composition that you really have to dig your heels into the ground, get your fingers dirty, bring people on that journey of the image with you, and hope that you all by the end of it kind of not only learn but are excited throughout that process. And that kind of understanding of like the exoskeleton of a painting, printmaking showed me kind of directly how to translate that in, like kind of standing behind, making those kind of initial marks and then kind of beautifying around it. So I guess I really learned to kind of map out in a way and understand what part of that mapping process starts in the beginning versus kind of finishes at the end.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, for myself, one of the ways I can describe it is like a contraction and expansion of like the mental process. Because usually in paintings, for myself, I have a way of, I can see the painting before it's finished, which so it was something I felt like I could translate over to printmaking, even though there's marks and there's ways that the marks get left in this kind of stasis through the process that I haven't been able to really anticipate. And I think I'll get more, when I get more familiar with it, I'll understand it more. But when it comes to, when it went from working on prints for a while and then going back to painting, it was kind of like going back and it's like sparring without weights, where I was able to paint in what felt like a more fluid manner, where I wasn't, the anticipation of the next move was more like, I'll get there when I get there. And I can work I mean, it was interesting. It was like everything became even more intuitive than what it was. It was because I felt not so concerned about how things may fall on the other side. And that was something that was really interesting. And what came out of it too is, I think, were better paintings. So it's a interesting pattern of thinking that goes into the process of printmaking.
And I just want to add one little thing. When you were saying that, it made me think about this idea where you think about a musician or an actor. Oftentimes, the singer that can also play piano, can play bass. Those are the musicians that make music that changes our lives forever. And oftentimes when people are just reading lyrics that they think have meaning and it kind of ends up being flat, I think that happens in the art world a lot. I think the best painters, from what I've gathered, is like they're always working on prints. They're always nitty gritty technical and really doing the work to allow the paintings to kind of bloom and be these big kind of romantic objects, whereas the prints are really where you kind of fine tune and you kind of put the work in. And it's obvious to see, the great prints around us, and you look at their work that aren't prints, and they're these kind of magical paintings as well. So it's this kind of underbelly or kind of frequency of making an image that I think is super important. And the more that I've gathered outside of just making the thing, all of those elements then go into that as well.
And I think it is just a kind of a testament. Challenge begets growth, right? Like, I think a lot of artists are working in this, in a way where they place limitations on themselves to see, if I focus on this one element, whether it's a painter or printmaker or sculptor, what can come out of the limits you place. If you have the whole world as your oyster, sometimes it's too much. And so if you place limitations, I think printmaking is a good way to play around with that and then see what sort of comes out of it and that you can apply. And that actually brings me to my next question, which is, I'm always curious to hear when artists prefer to work on a print project. I think whether it's, in tandem with painting, once a week or twice a week while you're also painting, or I think some artists prefer to finish a body of paintings and then focus on prints. So I'm always curious, love to hear what each of you like to do. Preference.
I would like to do them in tandem, both at the same time, but it's, given painting demands, it's almost like, for the sake of scheduling, you kind of, in my case, I feel like I have to do painting first, and then it's almost like, okay, let me get this work out of the way so I can have the time to focus on printmaking, which is, I hopefully as time goes on, I can find out a way to be able to do both at the same time and feel liberated, in both processes.
Yeah, I think ideally printmaking would be something that, as everyone said, I think could really feed back, into the paintings and vice versa. And for me, there is, like I was saying about time, something more durational about it that I'm interested in, and ideally there would be something kind of possible in terms of its durational aspect. Also iteratively, some things that to edition something is to have multiples, and I can imagine that playing out, more, conceptually, in my work in a way that paintings are so one at a time. And but in reality, it is a kind of leapfrogging of doing this and then kind of, fitting this in, and also kind of geographically where one is, and the kind of amount of focus and attention and collaboration and the gear changing, which is very real, like we talked about the collaborative aspect versus being, a solo painter. It's a really different way of thinking in all kinds of ways, socially, materially, procedurally, et cetera.
I think for me, what I set up with Justin at Pace Prints it was pretty much once a week. So I'd go do my thing, and I'd come back, and I'd always joke, I'd be like, Justin, my art therapist, because I'd get to kind of unload all of this kind of image frustration or material question, or prompting how the material could be extended in a different direction. So I would always kind of return to Justin as this kind of like, almost like boxing coach. It's like, hey, I just tried my best this week, and like, this is what I've come up with. He'd be like, all right, like, let's break this down and kind of spice it up and turn it over and think about it this way. And then the next week I'd go try these experiments at home, and I'd find different coffees, and I'd do it in different ways. I'd come back and be like, all right, let's try it. So it was this kind of collaboration outside of the first 6 months, which were very much kind of more like, you need to be here a lot so you can wrap your head around what's going on, and then you can have these kind of more kind of check-in print work days. So I think for me, I loved how in the beginning it was very intensive, and now it's more of like a check-in. And I teach once a week, and I go to the print shop once a week, and I feel like those are both great juxtapositions to being alone making paintings and thinking about shows and ideas and getting lost in that personal cauldron. It's like these artistic checkpoints with people that really are collaborators and visionaries and mentors, and reciprocity in a way where you're not just like lost in your own sauce, but you go out in the world and you engage and you have a tactile relationship. I think in a world of AI and automation and where we're all headed, like the Luddite in me loves printmaking. I love touching things, building things, learning how to use a tool that I just thought looked cool for 10 years. And now I'm like, I'm using that tool. Like, wow. It's like things that are very simple that you're just like, wow, this is what it's about. And this goes back, thousands of years. And it's a history that we get to still participate in and really combat the erasure of that tactile history as well.
Great, thank you. And Josephine, you mentioned kind of the iterative nature of prints and the edition work, and you've all worked in sort of different. You've done editions. Jameson, you're working in monotype, and Chase, you've done both monotype and sort of pretty small editions. And I'm sort of curious where you position monotypes relative to the edition work, relative to painting. You're all sort of pushing the boundaries of print in a lot of ways, and I'm curious sort of what purpose you see creating an edition as opposed to working in a monotype practice. Maybe we can start with you, Jameson, since you've done both very recently.
Can you say the question again?
Yeah, sorry. No, just how you if you work fluidly between sort of edition work and monotypes, and sort of where you position monotypes. I think from the market point of view, there's a certain view of monotype as unique work that I think maybe printmakers and artists aren't really thinking so rigidly between the differences. And I'm curious to know how you sort of consider your work in monotype versus like an edition lithograph, and yeah.
Yeah, for monotypes, the way that I think of it is kind of like painting from the inside out. So it's not. I mean, I find that to be in itself a very fun exercise, right? But the interesting thing is it's like when the edition, for example, like the lithograph, that felt extraordinarily like drawing. Like I was just drawing. I actually didn't really think about. And in some cases, when I look at the print, I definitely should have, but I didn't really think about how it would necessarily come out. And that's something about when I pick up like a crayon or a pencil, I go into this, I won't say it's autopilot, but it's very instinctive. So I didn't really, that felt more natural to me than say like working on a monoprint. because then I found myself where working on the monoprint and then seeing the print and being like, oh wow, damn, that's not what I was thinking would happen. So then having to be much more conscious of the end result. But from a market, I don't think about the market perspective ever. I don't even think I know how those two are received too much either. So it's but from like a technical perspective, I find them both to be really engaging, but monoprints definitely tricked me for a little bit. So.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was doing something in my paintings, which was like the thing you should never do, which is I made screen prints, but only used them once. Like the color chart on the bottom left of this painting, it was like a monoprint, but through screen printing. So I had, it was the most inefficient use of printmaking, but my paintings really needed it. And I think that kind of singularity of the printing process is something, through monoprints, which I've done, for fun, and I do for fun, but I haven't ever published any. But or kind of when they're integrated into the paintings, has been really in service to the experience of the singular art object. However, with editions, it's been something really, again, a way to think completely differently in terms of how something can exist in the world and in multiple. And but it's a different way of thinking, I guess. And I've made a large screen print edition with Experimental Print Institute at Lafayette, and those were. I really love that can be, that there can be so many of them. It's so completely different than the way I think about painting.
I think the way I started to understand editions versus unique works was really thinking about the ways that by creating a variation in the background, we're creating a variation in the landscape, which is changing how you perceive the subject, which is thinking about what time of day it is, what they're wearing, what the weather is. Like all of these kind of character development ideas start to come to play just from changing, someone sitting at the dinner table and it's a breakfast scene, but if that plate looks exactly the same and it's nighttime, you think it's a dinner scene, or a painting and that becomes a nocturne painting because there's a lack of light. Or the classic old prints here where they're very just kind of spot metered in the sense of like pure blacks and pure whites, and the whites just being kind of burnished off the plate become this like, forge shooting out molten bronze. And it's like, wow, all of that is just from the monochromatic reality of black and white. So I really got interested in how the variation in the monotype could allow color to set the landscape. But in more specifically, the baseball one here, Three's a Team, was the monoprint that we did in the show I recently had. And we changed the jerseys every once. So it was more of a variable edition. And through changing the jersey color, now all of a sudden, color had a direct relationship to geography. So you start thinking about, I don't care about art, or that doesn't affect me, but like I love the Jets and I'm going to have the green one. Or you think about the Chicago Bears and you want the dark blue and the orange, and you start recognizing, the kind of color theoretical potential is so obvious, and it happens in things like a green light, red light. It happens in ideas of color theory. And I think the monotype for me was a way to recognize how else can I use color outside of just setting the tone or the environment. So I got really excited in these kind of experimentations where you would just do kind of an off-put color and see what it was kind of sharing back with you after you had made it. So you had the opportunity to look at, with Justin, I was like, let's do Roy G. Biv, black, white, gray, and then look at it and decide which ones we really like before we make that decision just based on let's do green. So once we made the different colors, I could look at it and say, wow, these are the ones we should edition, but now we've developed these coffee inks in all these different colors that now we can use in different kind of extensions of other compositions that we're working on throughout developing the body of the work. So for me, I didn't think of it as a market standpoint. I didn't necessarily think about it as like there's only one of these in the world. It was just an opportunity to not get locked in. I think the artist in the print, lead printer dichotomy is really interesting because oftentimes print leads are very technical and they have rules set in their head and they want to do it to the T, where a lot of artists will come in, or I'm like, Justin, we're not doing it to a T. Like, let's mess this up. We're going to try different things here. And he's like, okay, and just like bending those bars a little bit where he's, making me understand the tightness quality, and I'm helping him just say, hey, let's actually remove one of those plates, or let's shift it this way and put it in crooked and leave the cut a little bit longer. And in these little engagements where he's like, oh, okay, and that kind of exchange just happened through experimentation, which led us to say, hey, some of these might just be a one-off, but we're okay with that because it excited us through the process. And it might not work for 10 to 25 of them, but for this one, I think we should move forward with the idea. So it opened up the kind of strict reality of editioning and what goes into the first edition, then making 20 more after that.
And
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, Chase brings up an excellent point too, which I forgot. I mean, it's major. It's like the element of time within the two different. So like in a monoprint, there's that immediacy of like, I mean, even though things are layered, all of it is very different from painting. I mean, painting, you can shift, pull, and move things around, and the evidence left behind is really very much up to the artist in terms of how you go about doing it. But with like a monoprint, it's like so much of that process is left underneath that layer that then will show itself in one way or another. And the manipulation, as far as I know so far, is that it's not so much in your control. And with the additions, it's like with the lithograph, which is really interesting, is like how you can layer that element of change and bring things and not necessarily move them. You can, but you can like dictate how much of that evidence is then left there for the viewer to engage with. And I think that element of time in any real visual process is really something fascinating for both the artist and the viewer. So it's those two things there I think are really exciting about, if I had to put it in terms of like pace, I would say like a lithograph is slower than a monoprint, and that's something that's really engaging.
I also wanted to add on to that too, that when you see your hand in a monoprint, which it is your hand, but it has that one remove and reversal. And one of the things I've also been interested in printmaking is how where my hand goes, sometimes it can completely disappear, and other times it feels like too present. And it's very mysterious in that way. It's not taken for granted like in painting. I was here and I made this mark. It's like you make the mark and then for a while it feels like recognizable as one's own mark. But then it can go through these processes where you kind of lose the trail of it, and then have to kind of bring it back. And in this etching I did with Wingate, we introduced some spit bite and sugar lift back into the print, which allowed for a kind of more direct sense of mark making into it. I felt like I'd just been almost making a kind of detached illustration at a certain point, which was not my intention, but it just kind of happened. And I think all those kind of layers and reversals, all of a sudden one finds oneself along this journey where it's kind of taken on its own kind of form, but one's own hand is, you can lose the tether of it and how to kind of bring it back. And I find that really interesting, as a painter, because it's like, I guess, looking in the mirror, seeing something, your face in reverse. You can kind of, it's familiar, but you don't quite recognize it in that moment as your own. And in that kind of unrecognition, something exciting, I think, is possible, too, that you really can't have, and that I haven't been able to have in painting.
Yeah. And something you were both, each of you was kind of saying about that your work versus in monotype or monoprint versus an edition work, it reminded me also of what you were saying about painting, this kind of back and forth and almost using monotypes as a tool to sort of then expand either the edition or vice versa. Like you zoom in on one thing and then you can zoom out into the other, or you can feel your gesture and get used to your gesture in the monotype and then pull it into something else that you're doing, even within print. It was funny. I was walking through the fair with a friend yesterday, and they were saying, I've never been to an art fair where I've walked through and looked at so much art but not talked about the subject of any of it. Everything is how how it's made. It's really,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
I was kind of prompted to think about something that Justin shared with me in the beginning of this process was when you think about printmaking, it's so much about layering and transparencies. And one of Justin's mentors was Cole Rogers, who's here from High Point, and I did a visit in Minneapolis, where I'm from, shout out, and Cole showed me, or kind of taught me through looking at these Willie Cole prints of the iron. It has this kind of like bursting magenta pigment. And he explained to me that when you're looking at any artwork, what's happening is light is coming into the room, hitting the object, going through the ink or the pigment, hitting the backing of whatever support is holding the information. And now it's kind of directly coming out through that color. And when you capture that on your phone, you're then seeing all of that magic through the sensor of the technological device that you're viewing, rather than looking at artwork up close and seeing what kind of reverberates off that. So recognizing the transparencies, the buildups, this kind of science and prism reality that's coming on, versus painting, which is a heavy body, opaque material, unless you're kind of mimicking the layering process by breaking it down. So the opacity tension between a painting and the like light and layering and kind of breath behind a print reminded me, I just recently started patinizing metal with acid, and it's a very similar relationship. So I'm already recognizing the transparencies from printmaking that are the same transparencies that are being heated and kind of acidizing these larger sculptures. And this relationship is this kind of nurturing of the backing or color. It's like the way you pull, you know, they clean that plate and that rag holds this information. And when you're patinizing the sculpture and you're rubbing the acid off, that rag holds information. And it's this kind of wax on potential where you're really, your body and your rhythm and your relationship to what you're actually applying to the material becomes a part of this kind of application process. So that tactile pressure now is kind of the same tactile pressure you apply to the brush alone, but now it's with four people and how they're kind of it's like synchronized swimming. It's like you watch these people navigate this huge piece of metal, and it's like to make this nice sensitive object that hangs on the wall, and it's like it's a great kind of balance between intellect, color, brawn, this kind of machine quality. Like, it just blows my mind, the capabilities of seeing someone's hand, how we all can have a different unique mark and work with these very specialized locations to locate that mark in a different way through any material and multiple different techniques. It really is totally like mind-bending experience. And I think thank you guys for doing the fair and putting print shops together and allowing people to make mistakes and be patient enough to kind of answer the questions that arise through that process.
It's a beautifully put, and a great, maybe a great place to stop and see if there are any questions, and leave it at that, and take any questions from the audience.
I think the performance idea is what separates the maker from the artist. It's someone that has the courage and the bravery to stand in a room full of people that know way more than you and say, hey, I know nothing, but I love color, and I'll come as many times as you'll have me. So for me, it was the kind of opportunity to say, hey, you know way more than me, but I'm very committed to this experience, and I think through our relationship, we can both learn a lot. But you definitely kind of stand in there and you're like, hey, I'm the guy today, and you guys are all waiting on me, and it's a very different relationship than kind of rolling out of bed and, for me, going to paint. So there's this, you put on your nice pants and you tuck your shirt in a little bit and you hope they respect you and give you time of day.
I would say in my case, it's the curiosity that overpowers the anxiety of it all. I look at the artists that I've admired and the beautiful prints that they've made, and I look at that and I'm like, well, I'll be a fool not to try, to at least get in the ring. So the curiosity definitely overpowers the anxiety.
Yeah, and I think it is, there's so much to learn. There is inevitably a certain kind of vulnerability there, and also people who want to work with you, they're invested in the work you've already made. They are curious about how they want to help translate the way you think to something else. And to do that requires an openness that is, curiosity, like you're saying, Jameson, and just but on both sides. And in that sense, I don't find it anxious. If anything, I feel, just very humbled. And, it's knowing how much knowledge not only the master printers possess, but also the labor that goes into it. I mean, the amount of, additioning, wiping plates and stuff, just that my body's not going through because theirs is. I think that there's a certain kind of pressure there that is, rooted in respect and admiration. How to kind of coexist with that and still be creative in that space is I think always a challenge. I also just wanted to say one thing in case I don't get a chance to say it, but Jennifer Roberts' Mellon lectures on printmaking, which just have taught me so much, and I haven't listened to them in a few years, but after this panel I'm going to listen again. But just also learning, not just through the making of it or working in a print shop, but also through learning, a whole world opened up, to me through those lectures and everything I've learned about printmaking and, fairs like the IFPDA too. There's just so much knowledge, concentrated into these spaces. How can we kind of imagine how our work can be translated through these different techniques is very exciting. Yeah.
And I think a little bit to add on to that too is like painting for me was a game of reverse engineering. I could go to these great museums and I'd look at a painting and I'd be like, stand in front of it like, oh, okay, I kind of get that. I kind of get it. So I think to your point, like when you look at a print, I'm like, I have no idea how they did this. So I have to go up to the door and be like, I don't know what's happening here. Can you share some information? So painting, it's this kind of response and intuitive kind of reckoning of action and pushing and raking and color decisions. But printing, it's like if you really don't know the nitty gritty, you have no clue what's going on. I did a fish print when I was like 5 years old. That was the only experience I had with a relief print before I stepped into the print shop. And I've tried like 7 different kind of arms of printmaking, and there's like 30 more. So I think it's a very endless kind of Pandora's box.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other final questions? Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, guys.
It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks.